Josh, for thank you very much for your kind introduction. I'm just going to check that we're actually working. Everybody see the second slide, okay? Good, that's great. Sorry, we're running. So I thank you very much indeed to the track committee for inviting me to present. Track's always been close to my heart, just for drinking my tea out of a track mug here. And As was mentioned earlier, it was actually a track paper which helped get me my permanent university job. So it's a particular pleasure and honour to be able to speak to you today. So to turn to graver matters, now in the second quarter of the 21st century, in the West, we live in a world undergoing radical and largely threatening changes, and the cultural developments advances underpinning our societies and contemporary mainstream archaeological discourse are under attack. We're all acutely aware of determined ideological reaction against egalitarianism, immigration, cultural diversity, women's, gay and trans rights, and so on, by movements threatening democracy, some threatening violence. Many potential outcomes are terrifying, and this is captured in a now oft-cited tag. The old world is dying and the new world struggles to be born. Now is the time of monsters. This is a compelling word image, usually attributed to Gramsci's writings penned in prison during a previous time of rising fascism. But in fact, it's apparently Slavoj Žižek's very loose translation of Gramsci's Italian. But it remains a vivid metaphor for the circumstances we now find ourselves in, both as citizens and also archaeologists investigating and interpreting the Roman era. The monsters are indeed now biting us. In the US, the UK, and continental Europe, these comprise convergent forces: post-conservatives, white supremacist ethno-nationalists, fascists or neo-Nazis backed by ruthless corporate billions. A congeries which I will use the umbrella term far right. Part of their ideological arsenal comprises drawing parallels and claiming lessons to imitate and warnings to heed from the so-called classical past, the ancient Greeks, especially militaristic Sparta and glorious Athens, and Rome, both the Republic, especially the senatorial order, and the Roman Empire and its frontiers, our turf. Emily Hanscom trailblazed much of this ground in her 2019 Theoretical Roman Archaeology Journal paper, but sadly the situation has got even worse since then. I'm also aware of Rob Witcher's and Richard Hingley's With the Roman Studies Roundtable at Rat Track 26, which sadly I wasn't able to get to. And I'm very grateful to Rob for information about that, although I don't know exactly what was discussed. So pardon me if much of what follows reinvents wheels, but hopefully this separate take will help further develop an urgent conversation. I may also get a bit polemical at times, we will see. What follows focuses on Anglophone Roman archaeology, which in practice Track still largely represented its participants, also with a heavy British bias in research focus, and the largely Anglophone societies in which it's embedded. And in fact, my main exemplar will be the case of the UK, especially England. And this choice is not blind Anglocentrism. While, as we'll see, there is, of course, immense value in pooling experience and ideas internationally and across cross-context comparison is invaluable. The uses to which Roman tropes are put are determined by the dynamics of each specific national situation. So perforce we must all deal with our own national arenas. Now, in the case of the UK, everyone's encountered examples of rightist misuse of the Roman past for contemporary political purposes, going back to British Tory politician Enoch Powell alluding to Virgil in his notorious 1968 Rivers of Blood anti-immigration speech. And then more recently, in 2021, Prime Minister Boris Johnson proclaimed this: when the Roman Empire fell, it was largely the result of uncontrolled immigration. The empire could no longer control its borders. People came in from the east all over the place, and we went into a dark ages. Sophisticated analysis there. Intensification of all this stuff across the West in the last decade is exemplified in the pronouncements and antics of Elon Musk. He's repeatedly claimed that the Roman Empire collapsed due to falling birth rates, while his supporters attempted to explain his Nazi gesture at a Trump rally as a Roman salute. So that's all right then. Current far-right propagandists cite Rome because of continuing familiarity and, if now vague, still deep cultural prestige of classical antiquity in Western societies. Whether we like it or not, history in the broad sense is political, and thus archaeology is too. And as Emily Hanscom said, archaeologists must become unapologetic political actors. Mm. So, besides being active private citizens resisting the rise of fascism in our own communities, what are we going to do about it as Roman archaeologists? And what can we do about it? How can we use our specialist knowledge and expertise to counter use of the Roman past to drive contemporary hate populism? Well, my credentials for addressing this were somewhat alluded to earlier on. I've long taken a special interest in public engagement. I spent a decade as an educational curator at the British Museum, during which in 1992, a year after TRAC was inaugurated, I published a paper including this cartoon, which developed a pleasing notoriety at the time, which, as you can see, of course, is somewhat germane to our discussion today, classical archaeology and the irritating distraction of the public. I also penned books for general readerships, adult and school age in that period. And all this remained on my radar back in the university sector. I was impact coordinator for the 2021 Research Excellence Framework exercise. So I must emphasize that I have observations to offer, but more questions than concrete proposals. My main objective here is to lay out the territory as I see it to promote this discussion. And preparing this was also deeply informed by timely appearance of two books. First was Randall Maguire's and Alfred González Ruibal's edited volume, Archaeology, Heritage and Reactionary Populism, which offers a global take on the issues from a public and a community archaeology perspective. This is immensely valuable, especially its comparative perspectives. But the editors also, as I mentioned earlier on, emphasize the various national contexts each have their own dynamics. The second crucial book is not by an archaeologist, but by an American professor of Latin. Curtis Dogier's White Pedestal is primarily focused on how American white nationalists, as he opts to call them, draw on classical textual sources for hateful propaganda, but he includes much European case material. This also reminds us that while vital for understanding the lands and societies dominated or annexed by Roman imperial power, Roman archaeology, is, of course, just part of a wider group of historical subdisciplines studying the Roman world. But sticking to archaeology for now, TRAC exemplifies how increasingly over recent decades, the research community has become critically self-aware, how it's developing approaches to its subject matter have tracked the mainstream zeitgeist in the Western countries in which it's overwhelmingly embedded. Current archaeological understandings of the Roman past are multiple and diverse, and this is a central academic strength compared with the former stale, narrow consensus on Romanization, which I was taught at the beginning of my career. But beyond ourselves, who have we been doing all this for? And this is a question also posed by Maguire and González Ruibal. It seems to me there's actually been woefully inadequate disciplinary effort to engage beyond the academy. Now, of course, it's long been good ethical practice and self-interest for archaeologists to engage with local communities, especially on field projects. And some Roman site-specific initiatives have international reach, such as the work of the Vinderlander Trust. And that my own school is a combined archaeology and ancient history unit, formed the basis for my colleague Sarah Scott's collaborative project, bringing archaeology and classics to new audiences, initially engaging highly multi-ethnic schools in Leicester City, resulting in one of our REF 2021 impact case studies, Roman Worlds for Diverse Communities. Now that represents substantial regional impact, but what about basic public conceptions and grand narratives about Rome on the national scale? It seems to me we've not seriously addressed how recent decades have seen a massive divergence, of course, paralleled in many other disciplines, between academic and popular discourses, in this case, historical discourses about ancient Rome. Public understandings, I would argue or contend, have hardly even absorbed the century-old concept of Romanization. And that's a generation after most specialists came to find it problematic at best. In the UK, seemingly many people still think of the Romans conquering Britain, ruling it for a period, then leaving again, like the British left India. So far as I can see, engaging with national scale audiences and education systems about big picture Rome has received negligible attention in recent UK and probably other Roman archaeologies. Now, this is partly attributable to the site or region focused nature of archaeology as a discipline, and theoretical aversion to writing grand narratives since the abandonment of culture history. But through much of the 20th century, it was also because of academic myopia. Why bother with such diversion of effort? Or active snobbery? I encountered this directly as an educational curator at the British Museum in 1993, when I published this highly illustrated work aimed at a general readership. A senior curator said cuttingly, "I have seen your picture book." More recently, lack of engagement can be substantially attributed to institutional pressures to churn out international quality, scholarly research outputs or die. You probably are all familiar with this. But of course, this also still arises from a need to accumulate cultural capital. Yet, the Roman archaeology community, this is where I'm going to get polemical for a minute, still seems to voluntarily ascribe little importance to wider engagement, even when thinking blue sky thoughts about the discipline, as it was at the foundation of TRAC. And this is, I suggest, reflected in the framing of TRAC's constitution. According to Article 2, these are the aims of TRAC: to promote theory in Roman archaeology, clues in the name, to provide a forum for the wider archaeological community, to engage and value a diverse community. Now, that third bullet is the shortest and the vaguest. It presumably meant engagement beyond the archaeological community. But in practice, what attention has TRAC actually given to this? And this is, after all, the forum to ask such a question. In 2013, discussing archaeology as a whole, the prehistorians John Robb and Timothy Porketat warned as follows, as is the script on the screen here. I won't actually read that out because one of the things I know annoys the hell out of John Robb is speakers reading the text that's on the screen in front of them. But you get the gist, particularly the point about if we don't do this, write big narratives, then others will do so unknowledgeably in ways we don't like. And then in 2025, Maguire and González Ruibal argued that misleading historical narratives spun by right-wing political hacks are indeed now a growing reality. But in his new white pedestal, Curtis Dozier reveals something even darker for Greece and for ancient Rome. To précis Dozier's take, American white nationalists promote both alleged Greco-Roman justificatory precedents and cautionary exemplars for a range of themes covering the full gamut of far-right ideology. Hierarchy over social equality, naturalizing subordination or domination of lesser groups. This underpins pretty much everything else. Traditional gender structures and relations as valued but imperiled, so that's homophobia, transphobia, and misogyny, especially white women forgetting their place and not having enough white babies. Racism, white supremacism, alleged inferiority of non-white people, violence spun as defensive against the alleged violence of malevolent aliens, but also glorifying violence to subordinate, conquer, and even annihilate those inferiors. And then the grand notion of Western or white, implicitly or overtly white civilization, presented as superior, but with narratives of decadence, decline, and danger of fall, even eventual racial extinction. These strands are woven into a web, generating fear of alien invasion, subverting and contaminating white civilization, with other races eventually annihilating the white race by outbreeding it or direct extermination, great replacement theory. Now, much of this is paralleled in Europe, albeit with variations. While far rightists, both sides of the Atlantic, are typically racist, the Islamophobia currently being whipped up in the UK being an odious example, and stridently homophobic and transphobic, misogyny appears much deeper in America, related to the specifically reactionary Christian flavour of its nationalism. But where do the ideas about Rome deployed to advance far-right ideologies actually come from? Especially those where archaeology most obviously has things to say, such as those on the slide. Dozier meticulously documents how, for the Greco-Roman past, far-right propagandists are not lying in Trumpian post-truth style. Though they often simplify and spin their claims to near absurdity, they're not using political hacks to pen new, blatantly misleading historical narratives, such as those González Ribal documents for post-Roman Spanish history. The reality is actually worse. Dozier traces the pipeline for the rhetoric deployed by the far right about ancient Rome and Greece in America and Europe back to its sources, to people he characterizes as white nationalist intellectuals, some with training in the classics, some are or have been academics, albeit often not in classical studies, although I'll note that Enoch Powell was formerly the youngest professor of ancient Greek in the British Empire. Dozier documents how for decades they have been doing something much more robust and harder to combat than newly applying crude fascist filters to antiquity. This is at two levels. White nationalist intellectuals co-opt real scholarship on the classical world, much of it used without distortion, because there are plentiful older publications by eminent ancient historians which evoke white supremacist, misogynist, and other views which almost all current scholars now deem hateful, but which were mainstream when they were written. For example, Tenny Frank in 1916, blaming Rome's fate on orientalization of Rome's populace, Theodore Monson decrying parasitic immigrants in the Roman provinces, and not least Edward Gibbon, who gave us the modern narrative of decline and fall, of course, and its use as a moral mirror for Western societies. The far right emphasised the prestige of such authors, men who should be heeded, but their subsequent academic discrediting is erased or itself weaponised. Level 2, they cite genuine evidence from the Greco-Roman world, typically not archaeology, but classical writings used selectively, but with no need to distort or misrepresent their meanings beyond, crucially, as Dozier points out, retrojecting them onto modern notions of race. Various ancient sources advocate domination of other groups through violence. Plato promoted authoritarian hierarchy and eugenics. Aristotle advised his student Alexander the Great to treat Greeks as subjects but Asiatic barbarians as slaves. That Alexander and later the Roman Empire failed to heed Aristotle is taken as a warning for the modern West. In the Roman period, Strabo, Seneca, and Cicero all made what we would now call anti-Semitic statements, and so on. Of course, far-right use of all this material silently omits the different cultural context of the primary ancient sources and subsequent discrediting of earlier scholarship, especially ignoring archaeology with its complementary and ever-expanding data sets. So all we have to do is present new evidence and better properly underpin narratives to the public, and all will be well. Right. Okay, well, what follows builds on the insights of Maguire, González Ribal, and Dozier by drawing on my own experience in public engagement, primarily in the UK context, about Rome and the European Iron Age. Now, they have focused especially largely on the supply side of propaganda about the past, though González Ribal especially offers important insights into how and why people seek and consume this stuff. I want particularly to address the demand side further, and also the mechanics of supplying public history as groundwork for any plan of action. So switching from economic metaphor to educational framing, to communicate anything new to anyone, we all know a fundamental is establishing what they already know, often here think they know, in this case about the Roman world. Not least, we need to consider how they acquired their current understandings and what these mean to them. Now, we all encounter characteristic public images of and attitudes towards Rome in Western countries. They had the first modern army, a huge, shiny, exciting war machine exemplifying military efficiency, which built regular forts and brought peace to the barbarians. And in its wake, Roman government brought civilization, literacy, and law. So typically, this is what I characterize in this image from my favorite movie of all time, Monty Python's The Life of Brian. Marvelous people, the Romans. They were just like us. They're seen at least as culturally ancestral, if they're not regarded as actual forefathers and founders of our countries. I think the difference is here, of course, Britain, the Romans are deemed not as directly ancestral because the English came in, whereas in France, they are rather more seen as directly ancestral. And people admire Roman prefiguring of our houses with central heating, towns full of grand engineering and architecture, linked by roads carrying manufactured goods from distant lands. We all know the stereotypes. Now, at least in the case of Britain, although not usually articulated as such, this is an imagined benign colonialism by the people who gave us that word. Although, in my experience, significantly, it's not framed as colonialism, but rather as a mirror prefiguring our current national life as a modern state. Now, this is actually where I disagree with González Ruibal's characterization of British popular conception of our own national history as longing for our recent imperial past. Now, there may well be some people who do so yearn, but I think vastly more prevalent since 1950, among white Britons at least, has been a quiet but profound forgetting of our colonialist history, a massive self-protective erasure of our empire, and parallel sanitization of the colonialism of culturally ancestral Rome. So Rome was once lauded as precedent and model for a British imperialism, which became uncomfortable historical baggage. So what had been British imperial pride was displaced by the powerful post-World War II mythos of the plucky little island which stood alone against the world in 1940 as a basis for modern identity, especially white English identity. So this is a national rather than imperial narrative, which even erases deep British dependency on the white dominions like Canada and Australia, let alone colonized India and Africa. So this imperial amnesia regarding British history was extended to understandings of Rome, which still served as a precedent and model, but now just for our advanced civilization. Anyway, with such nation-specific manifestations, this is the playing field at which we need to contest far-right propaganda exploiting the Roman past. But how have Western publics formed their understandings of the Roman world? This is the answer in my own case. Equally important, how do they continue to be reproduced even in supposedly post-colonial world? I mean, when I was 8, Britain was still giving up colonies. Why the current popular historical understandings of Rome? Well, in Europe, I think most people learn something about Rome in formal school education. I can only speak in any detail for England, which has a national curriculum separate from the other countries in the UK. And I had some involvement with a 1995 revision of the history component while I was at the British Museum. Now, in England, most school students only encounter Romans at primary level, so there is little space for any conceptual sophistication. The current version of the history curriculum, adopted in 2014, which we see here, finally adopted the term Romanization, a century after it was coined and after its widespread scholarly problematization. So that's one consideration. And then we come to books. And in the 1990s, when I was writing this one and other children's books, I asked several publishers, how they decided what to put into new books on the Romans aimed at schools. And it turned out they didn't ask academics what teachers and school students needed. They asked teachers what they wanted. This was about sales, not about improving curriculum content. It was a closed loop, reproducing what teachers had learned in school themselves a generation earlier and excluding academia, which was anyway making little effort to insert itself into the discourse. That was in the UK. But in the US, do most people outside elite schools, where some of them still will learn Latin and Greek, encounter the Roman world in formal education at all? Anyway, across the West, people seemingly get much of their understanding of the Roman past from popular media. Some is purportedly factual through general readership books, we touched on, and TV documentaries. Now, as a genre, television history programming, especially for more distant periods like Rome or ancient Egypt, is usually treated as comfort zone entertainment, giving people more of what they already think they know and love, like Egyptian pharaohs, or love to hate, Hitler. It's not designed to challenge their basic understandings about the past. There are very strong rules of media discourse, again, firmly market-driven. I can give an example of this from my own experience. In the 1990s, I was engaged as a script consultant for an American TV series on Rome, and I tried to include stuff about the provinces. But there was strong pushback from the commissioning network, which demanded more of the emperor's shagging donkeys stuff they thought their audiences expected. Oversimplifying due to pressure of time, most existing podcasts and YouTube channels, with exceptions we'll come back to, whether corporate or independent, tend to follow similar comfort zone rules. And there are video games, which are a closed book to me, but it's pretty clear they typically portray Rome in the established manner in terms of admirable imperial grandeur and or exciting violence and glory. Of course, video games have now been around for decades, giving people imagery of Rome. Yet, historical fiction movies have a century-long pedigree as a medium for disseminating images and ideas about Rome. Ridley Scott's 2000 Gladiator, Gladiator 1 as it's now become, was itself a partial remake of the 1964 flop Fall of the Roman Empire, which killed the venerable sword and sandal genre going back to Ramon Navarro's 1925 Ben-Hur. Scott revived the genre. Now, what sold him on making Gladiator 1 was not actual Roman archaeological or even textual evidence. It was an 1872 visual reimagining, an historical genre painting. Jean-Léon Gérome's Pollice Verso, now in the Phoenix Art Museum in Arizona. Now, this exemplifies how fictional representations feeding popular understandings of Rome today build on prior cultural discourse, which is already becoming unmoored from historical reality in the 19th century. Witness the long popular factoid of Roman galley slavery, which didn't exist. It was actually invented in the hugely popular original Ben-Hur novel published in 1880. That then is the playing field, and it's already tilted against us even before right-wing propagandists deliberately tilt it further. Historical understandings shared by entire nations for generations are immensely resistant to change. We have this terrible problem of cultural inertia to try to deal with. Further, history of our own cultures, like exotic ancient Egypt, of our own or other cultures, like exotic ancient Egypt, can be seen as a place of escape from anxiety generated by contemporary politics, again, because it's familiar and deemed to be stable in an uncertain world, somewhere people can harbour cherished, comforting beliefs and assumptions, even semi-acknowledged fantasies about what the past was like, and perhaps what the present should be like. Notions of personal, family, community, and national origins, historical origins, are commonly foundational to people's sense of ontological security and may have been unexamined and unquestioned since laid down in childhood. They're of profound emotional importance. For many people, then, intellectual arguments challenging their received understandings of history will not excite curiosity to learn more and rethink. They're perceived not as revelation, but rather as threat, even attack. Deeply unwelcome, they're seen as undermining and disorientating. They'll trigger powerful negative emotional reactions. dismay, even intense fear, rapidly translating into the anger and hostility on which far-right politics preys. And this was commented on by Gonzalez Ribal and Maguire. Archaeologists have not taken emotions, and particularly negative emotions, seriously enough. I think this is a critical point. So to segue back to echoes of Rome in popular history, and an especially powerful and topical example of both historical comfort blanket and anchor for contemporary identity, is the case of America's massively Roman Republican themed foundational mythos, rooted in the writings of the ancient senatorial elite on which America's founding fathers, also slave-owning oligarchs, modeled themselves, physically manifested in Roman-style iconography and architecture of power. Now, this discourse has become mythologized to the point of not just comforting foundation story of American national identity, especially in this 250th anniversary year, but quasi-religious state cult. And to question it, as public historian Tad Sturmer is doing brilliantly, I think, is tantamount to treason. Now, given the immense inertias and powerful pre-existing emotive dynamics in such popular historical discourse, any attempt by archaeologists to shift perceptions of the Roman world can be really up against it. And we're not in a favourable starting place. So archaeology's current academic strengths of nuance, diversity, and competing paradigms, the antithesis of a clear, simple, unified narrative, potentially translate as grave weaknesses in seeking to engage with popular discourse on Rome. So where scholarship is now structurally designed to problematize received wisdom and explore multiple alternatives, the far right have a vastly easier task to achieve their aims by resonating with and amplifying existing embedded notions about the Roman world, many of which are already all too amenable to their objectives. Rightists can instantly discredit modern scholars' counter-arguments in the eyes of many by labeling them woke, Marxist, dupes of multiculturalism, and so on. So what can we do? As I said, given the national specificity of the dynamics, I'll discuss the example of the UK, and as Scotland and perhaps Wales are different, even more specifically England, although much of the following is potentially adaptable to the US context and perhaps others. We need a strategy. Now, as this is in origin a good Greek military term, to structure my thoughts on it, I'm going to pursue a military metaphor, as you might expect given my background, rather than strategy being a neoliberal business model, which is what we've come to be accustomed to in universities. A military model also is more appropriate because we find ourselves fighting far-right initiated culture wars. Anyway, developing strategy requires seeking and cooperating with allies, to maximize our strength. So we might think of that maybe as grand strategy. I'm going to push this analogy. Gathering intelligence about the battleground, the landscape, who's on it and where, what they're doing, their motives and objectives, methods and capacities, strengths and vulnerabilities. Now, we've already looked at part of this. We'll look at a bit more in a minute. Logistics. What are our resources and capacities? Objectives. Setting those are going to depend on the foregoing, and of course, likewise, tactics. How in practical terms are we going to achieve our objectives? So first of all, seeking alliances. I mean, most obviously, it will be very sensible if we're going to make any serious efforts in this direction to ally with like-minded ancient historians and other classicists like Curtis Dozier. And this is also because of another property of the landscape in which we find ourselves, which we have not shaped. Most audiences see ancient Rome as the domain of history, which is Julius Caesar and so on, which archaeologists sometimes help illustrate in fascinating ways like digging Pompeii. So we're going to need to at least pitch this primarily as history, even if we then try to get some archaeology in. But maybe the archaeology isn't the point, it's the conclusions, the ideas. The interpretations. We also need to work with historians of other periods, notably those working in modern colonialisms, and particularly public historians, people like Tad Sturmer. And of course, also, we are likely to be able to get hot tips from public communication and media experts and practitioners, and some of those will come back to in a minute. And then we need to understand the battlefield, the battleground, which we are contesting with the far right. So we've already looked at the opposition as such. The strategic goal is to win over the public from the far right via, again, let's stick with the military metaphor, hearts and minds operations. But the public we need to reach, even just looking at England, of course, as soon as you think about it, it's obviously not monolithic. It's rather a complex of social classes, national, regional, and ethnic identities, genders and age sets. Whoops, hit the button. Sorry about this, slight tangle. There we go. Right, yes, genders and age sets and so on, with a spectrum of political outlooks and existing historical understandings. Thinking about these is surely the most immediate task, not least because we have to decide where to target and tailor effort. Then there's resourcing and capacities. Now, even with allies, resourcing and capacities are going to be very limited against so much of Western states and media now being under the sway of the far right or in the hands of sympathetic corporate enablers. Still, we are powerless. As Gonzalo Ribal says, archaeologists have the unrivaled advantage of direct access to the material past, which allows us to produce more authentic, fresh, accurate, and original stories versus the endless rehashing of populism. He's got a good point there. In UK higher education and correspondingly elsewhere, the impact agenda potentially provides incentive, institutional rationale, and perhaps routes to resourcing. But as universities are becoming increasingly corporate and politically restrictive, the effort may have to operate largely outside them. And then there's defining objectives, reaching people. Who do we consider the key demographics to try to reach, since we're not going to be able to address everybody? Children are obviously vital for the longer term. We should, of course, try to reach them outside formal education, but influencing school teaching and the curriculum could be the most important single objective for the long term, potentially in alliance with modern historians regarding teaching about colonialism in particular. In England, now is an apparent opportunity to effect some change. November 2025 saw publication of an independent review of the national curriculum, which recommended changes in history teaching. Groups like the Roman Society and the Classical Association took part in the consultation process and will now try to influence implementation, assuming this happens. If we get a reformed government, I doubt that will happen. But anyway, I would hope that Roman archaeologists are already involved in this, but I don't know the details. Otherwise, we'd have missed the boat with school education in England for at least another decade. But which other sectors of the public or demographics should we prioritise? Should we not focus on the particular targets of far-right propaganda and those most receptive to it? That is the white working class, especially boys and men, the demographic most failed by the education system, including universities. Now, we may be able to tailor messages to them, but can we get their attention in the first place? Many will be in silos of hostile legacy and social media. That, I think, is an important point to discuss. And then there's deciding tactics. What exactly are we going to deliver and how? And we must, of course, challenge particular existing misuse of the example of Rome in campaigns to harness and redirect public fear and anger away from the real threats, corporate greed and oligarchic lust for power, towards scapegoats, minorities and migrants. But we can seek to expose the hidden agenda of those doing this, that is the interest of the already and wannabe powerful, something which is already widely attempted by those critiquing the far right. But that is to remain essentially reactive. Can we also take the initiative promoting a new, different narrative about the Roman world? This would have to be simple and compelling like the received one. The contested space strongly excludes nuance. It's hard to imagine anything more against the grain of contemporary multivocal archaeology. Still, it may be possible to find consensus on just a handful of key ideas, which may be all that's required. One focus, I would certainly suggest, would be on what Rome actually was. what, whom, where the term covered, and therefore what it was not. That under the emperors, economically, culturally, and then militarily and politically, this wasn't the most important part of the empire. That was. Anyway, hopefully we can discuss that. And then there's framing and pitching whatever messages we decide we want to communicate. We need to tailor them and their presentation to how and why different parts of the public engage with history. Now, Gonzalo Ruibal, again, in his very valuable recent publications, commented about how the reactionary populists, as he frames them, excel at subversion of language, reversing things. And he's suggesting that we do much the same with appropriating concepts from them. And that's, get this right a minute. There we are. Such concepts include notions of heroism, bravery, and epic. But we have to remove them from the realm of violence and aggression in which they usually work and transfer them to the realm of daily life. From this perspective, care and hospitality can be heroic and epic. So in his view, to reach some demographics at all, we must use populist tactics, devising positive narratives pitched in similarly emotive terms. Of course, this again goes against training, habit, and the rules of academic discourse, which seeks to be truthful and apply rationale, evidence-based argument dispassionately. These are our defaults. Then there are media delivery and engagement. We should certainly publish more books designed for public audiences, but these are not interactive, have long lead times and limited readerships, and many we need to reach don't read books. Online channels are obviously vital. Social media, including blogs like Curtis Dozier's valuable Pharos blog, and especially podcasts and YouTube presentations. The hypothetical alliance of Roman archaeologists and historians needs many voices out there. Now, a very successful Spanish language example, whom Gonzalo Ruibal cites, is an archaeologist with a doctorate from the University of Leicester. Hurrah! Miquel Herran Subiñas, whose Puto Miquel YouTube channel has over 300,000 followers, mostly young people. So it shows what can be effective. It would also be valuable to have nationally and internationally prominent public intellectual advocates like these guys to reach the still powerful legacy media. Which brings us to one last part of the landscape which I haven't addressed, and that's public intellectuals who are already talking about Rome. So I asked Google AI this question: who are our public intellectuals on the subject of the Roman world? And this is the list it generated. Now, no, I didn't specify Anglophone, which is an illustration of the dodginess of AI, which you're probably familiar with. All but one of these figures are academic specialists, not right-wing hacks. Most are conservatives with at least a small c. The estimable Mary Beard certainly challenges orthodoxies, especially patriarchy, but that's still from a traditional Cambridge classics perspective. That is text-driven and strongly focused on elite perspectives in late Republican and early imperial Italy, very different from many of us archaeologists. Now, to me, in this list, Greg Wolfe stands out in two ways, I think causally related. As most clearly open to using archaeological evidence, he's chief editor of Journal of Roman Archaeology, as many will know, and to embracing provincial and cross-cultural perspectives. Still, none of these is an archaeologist. They are all historians, and Greg sticks largely to books, not more popular media. Now, of public intellectuals with national traction in the UK, I think closest to Roman archaeology as such is probably currently Alice Roberts, Professor of Public Engagement in Science at the University of Birmingham, paleopathologist turned archaeology communicator and prominent humanist. Now, her recent book, Domination, was about the fall of the Roman Empire and the rise of Christianity. Now, while it's an archaeologically informed book about the Roman world and its aftermath, it appears to be especially a humanist riposte to historian and prolific podcaster Tom Holland's Dominion, which argued for the Roman Empire-rooted foundational role of Christianity for Western values. Robert's Domination is about how Christianity was especially a vehicle for elites to maintain their power during the transition from Roman to medieval Europe. Holland's Dominion has been seen as history verging on Christian apologetics. And while Holland is not himself far right, his work fuels it. Reportedly, the American activist Charlie Kirk said Dominion helped convince him that the canon of Western values was rooted in Christianity. So here's, I think, a very good example of entanglement of conservative historical treatments of the Roman world and related topics with far-right politics, with Robert's riposte exemplifying challenge by more radical perspectives strongly rooted in archaeology as well as ancient texts. Anyway, whatever the specific merits and demerits of either book, to me, Robert's Dominion represents something like the public discourse we need to urgently develop, and it is at least a valuable point for discussion. And regarding discussion, I will end here and thank you very much for joining and hand back to Nicholas and Dragos.
Thank you very